And I'm going to share my screen again.
People want to turn their videos off, I think.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time this morning to join us for our first webinar. My name is Cliona Mahoney. I am the coordinator for the Dublin City North Children and Young People's Services Committee, and I'm delighted to open up this event on behalf of CYPSC and our collaboration with Barnardos, who have been instrumental in helping us to get this webinar organised for today and to enable us to connect with the speakers we have today. So we are very excited about this. I think it's also great to see so many different sectors that have been represented on this particular webinar today, and it's great to see so much interest. And I'm just going to give you a quick reminder again, just to please make sure that your cameras are off and that your microphones are on mute. We are recording this webinar and we will make it available on the CYPSC website. So for those of you who may not be very familiar with us, the Children and Young People Services Committee is an interagency committee made up of statutory, community and voluntary services with the aim of working collaboratively to improve the lives of children and young people 0 to 24, aligned with the Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures framework. And we are supported by TUSLA Child and Family Agency and the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. And I'd particularly like to welcome the Chair of Dublin City North CYPSC here, who is a participant today, Joy McGlynn. In that context, COVID-19 has brought about many unexpected transitions and changes into the lives of families, children and young people. And that transition from a normal life into a full lockdown where all our connections with families, friends, the connection for children, young people with school and education, etc., was all cut off. And now we are in a new phase where we are re-emerging from a lockdown and we are looking to support children and young people in that reintegration. And of course, within that kind of new normal that we're working into now, the experience of the full lockdown, the experience of COVID-19 and the impacts that that has all brought has looked different for every different child and for every family as well. So today's webinar will aim to see these transitions through the lens of trauma and to look at and think about some of the ways that we as services can support that reintegration in the most helpful way. So just to also acknowledge that there are a number of thank yous here, first and foremost to Barnardos and particularly to Clodagh Carroll, who is also with us today in terms of helping us to organise this webinar. I'd also like to thank the Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures programme funding and the sponsorship from the Safe and Protected from Harm subgroup of the Dublin City North CYPSC. And also a very special thank you in advance to all our speakers and our panellists who are here with us today to help us think about some of these pieces that can help us to support children and young people. And that is Siobhan McGee, Katrina Onwright, Emerald Jane Turner, and Dr. Claire Short. So I would like to welcome you to this webinar to formally open it. We hope that you enjoy it. Just remind you again that we are recording and to please ensure that your mics and cameras are off. And when you do have questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen there. So I would now like to, without further ado, hand over to Siobhan McGee, who is going to open up, and I'm going to let all the speakers introduce themselves to give them full justice to their expertise and experience that they're bringing to us today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Cliona, and thanks to Barnardos and to TUSLA for inviting us to come along. So my name's Siobhan McGee, and I'm a psychotherapist and a supervisor and a consultant working in the, I work both as a teacher of psychotherapists for the Corona Institute in the UK, which is a mindfulness and body-oriented psychotherapy training. But I've also spent about 25 years working as a therapist in various organisations, and I've worked as a consultant specialising in trauma with organisations in the UK and Europe, and I've worked with organisations like London Fire Brigade and also several mental health and homelessness charities in the UK, helping them to look at becoming psychologically informed and what's now known as trauma-informed organisations. And Emerald, my colleague Emerald, and I have been working with Barnardos and Better Finglas, in particular the ACE Forum, since June last year, and we've been working to provide some resources and some training to help those agencies to become more trauma-informed. So we're really excited to be here today. Really sorry that we can't all be here in person. You know, we're sort of very aware that there's a lot of expertise and experience in the participants, you know, in you all, and we'd love to be in a room together, just sort of sharing, you know, all the information and, you know, taking some space together to really think about trauma and transition. And we all know that, you know, change is difficult at the best of times, but for people with adverse childhood experiences or history of developmental trauma, change is a particular trigger, and can be a particular trigger. So hopefully today we're going to be able to give you some information. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we're going to be covering in a moment, but first of all, I'd just like to invite the panel to introduce themselves. So that will mean unmuting yourselves when I call out your name, panel. So Emerald, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Siobhan. Well, it is lovely to have this opportunity to be in the webinar with this panel today and with all of you, and all of your wisdom and experience. So my name is Emerald Jane Turner. I'm an occupational therapist, I'm a psychotherapist and an interfaith minister. And as Siobhan said, we've been working together with Barnardos and Better Finglas since last year. So my background is really, I've spent about 40 years in the field of psychiatry, mental health, and my training was one of the first trainings at Karuna, which so means my approach is body-centered and psychospiritual. And I've worked with large traumatic events such as the terrorist attacks in London. So at that time I was helping TfL oversee that, getting their staff back to work, supporting their counsellors, as I was their external supervisor at that time. So I've got a really keen interest in how people delivering treatment stay well and stay authentic. And I've done some research for Babette Rothschild for her Help the Helper book around that. And that's the area that I'd really like to focus my contribution on today. I currently sort of supervise NHS and hospice staff, end-of-life care, palliative care and so on, supporting them with that. So I'll say a little bit about that today. That's me. Thank you.
So Christina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today, and I'm very excited about the diversity of the group tuning in to this webinar. I think it's wonderful. Trauma is an aspect of the lives of many people across country, and my personal belief is that we all need to be supporting children in our own unique way, depending on the role that we play in our workplace. My interest is particularly in developmental trauma, and that was partially driven by my own experience of trauma, early trauma, and I suppose my journey through the last many years of trying to find recovery and healing for that. And that's been a very insightful experience for me, and inspiring, particularly by the people who've been around me to help me with that. And that's something that I really feel strongly about, that we find ways of bringing relationships to traumatized people in order to support their recovery and empowerment that they so need in order to be able to feel that they can get their lives on track again, but also to be able to see positivity and derive meaning from their experiences in order to help them to have a positive life. So today I'm going to be talking about particularly about children and developmental trauma, but relating it to COVID and my experience in practice in the field. I didn't say I'm a child and family psychotherapist, and I specialise in developmental trauma and attachment, and have particularly become interested because of my own experiences of working with the body, and how crucial it is for us to be somehow able to incorporate body work with children and helping them to overcome early trauma.
Thanks, Christina. And last but certainly not least, Claire, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. This is really strange because you can see me and I can't see you. So that's already a dilemma, isn't it, when we're talking about relationships and trauma. And I'm very delighted to be here. I guess coming from my profession, I've been working in child and adolescent psychiatry for 20 odd years, and before that in adult mental health. And I left the NHS a year ago, which, talking about mind, body and what we hold in the body, my shoulders have hugely lightened since I let go of being an NHS consultant. I can't tell you how heavy it was by the time I left. And I've just set up with two really lovely colleagues a charity in Bristol called Open Minded, and we primarily work in schools to provide reflective practice for pastoral teaching and senior leadership staff. But also we're interested in working with young people and families, and we are doing a particular project in a special school for children who've come from troubled families, taking a multi-family approach, which is quite unusual, and engaging these families to help young people get back into education. So that's quite exciting. And I'm very interested in the mind-body interface and would argue there is no such thing that's part of the same thing, and have been getting increasingly interested in breath and biofeedback, and collaborating with people like Graham Music at the Tavistock, who's also very interested, and through my own practice. So I feel that it has a lot to offer when it comes to talking about trauma and regulation of mood and experience. So that's me.
Great, thanks, Claire. So at this point, we said that we would lock the meeting. So if I can ask one of the co-hosts to now lock the meeting, which means that those who were meant to be joining will not be able to join, but they hopefully will be able to get a copy of the recording. Great, thank you. Okay, so we're talking about trauma and transitions, and what I'd like to do first of all is I'd just like to invite us all to just take a deep breath. So just to breathe, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about the nervous system, and one of the best ways to regulate the nervous system is to take a deep breath and to breathe out, right? So just to take a breath and just take a deep breath out. And what we're actually doing in that is we're regulating our nervous system to be able to prepare us to take in new information, because we've got quite a lot of information to share with you. So when we talk about trauma, we're not just talking about the mind, we are talking about a very embodied process, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the nervous system. And in particular, a quite recent theory called the polyvagal theory, which is really, really helpful to understand when we're thinking about trauma. Then we're going to, Emerald's going to talk about regulation. As she mentioned, that's an area that she's really interested in, and is an area that we really need to understand about in terms of the nervous system. And the polyvagal theory really does talk to that. And Christina, being a child psychotherapist in Dublin, is going to be able to talk about practice and how to, what that looks like in practice. And at the end, we're hoping we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes at the end to have a sort of question and answer with the panel. I'll share that discussion. So if you've got any questions, just maybe send through the chat box the questions, and then I can put those to the rest of the panelists at the end of the presentation. Okay, so you'll hear us talking about Bessel van der Kolk. He is a trauma specialist. He's written a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a very well-known book on trauma. And one of the things that he has been saying about COVID-19 is, and lockdown, is that it matches the 6 precursors to trauma, which is what he says are natural precursors to trauma. And Christine, you might need to just mute yourself for a moment. So he talks about lack of predictability, a sense of immobility, lack of connection, numbing out, time disorientation, and lack of safety. And all of these things are precursors to trauma. And so if someone has had developmental trauma, they may have, this is the kind of soil that they might have grown in, you know, one that feels very uncertain, unpredictable. And so when you then come to thresholds or transitions, they then become these kind of places that constellate all of this lack of predictability, a sense of disorientation, uncertainty. And we certainly find ourselves in that right now. So anybody who's had adverse childhood experiences would be finding themselves you know, either going into lockdown or coming out of lockdown. So for some people, lockdown has felt very safe because they felt in a very kind of protected, safe bubble. And obviously that's not the case in every situation. And for other people, coming out, there's this threshold of coming out of lockdown and back into, you know, the world can feel very uncertain and very unsafe. And there's some research that the Anna Freud Centre in London with the University College London have been doing. They've launched a series of research reviews gathering research from across Europe, and some of the evidence that they found is that the pandemic and lockdown are certainly having impacts on children and young people's mental health. There's an increase in contributing to the onset and exacerbation of worry, fear, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. And of course, it's caused major disruption to people's lives, you know, schools being closed and, you know, lots of different pressures arising. And particularly with all the confusing and, you know, sort of uncertain situation about how to come out of lockdown and is it safe, is it not? This is all adding to these precursors to trauma. And we know that children may be more vulnerable to the mental health impacts of the pandemic, including those with pre-existing mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions, but also children from minority ethnic groups, where we know the coronavirus is amplifying the inequalities associated with social determinants of mental and physical health. So all of this is the context within which we're sort of speaking into. So as I've said before, in trauma, we need to talk about the body. We need to talk about our nervous systems, because trauma is, you know, it's laid down in the nervous system, in the brain, in the, you know, it's a biological, neurophysiological process that happens in the body, and it's all about orienting to safety, threat, and danger. So this is where the polyvagal theory comes in, and I think it's, you know, it's brilliant. It's a very intuitive process, and for those of us who've been working in the field of body-oriented mind-body therapy, it makes a lot of sense, and there's science now that we can kind of call on to say, well, look, this is what's happening. It's the most recent theory of the autonomic nervous system, and it was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. And what it speaks to really is that the old concept, or the traditional view of the nervous system, was that there were 2 branches of the nervous system, the sympathetic, or the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, which was responsible for activation and mobilization, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which was seen as a calming nervous system, which was basically responsible for resting, repose, and peaceful states. And it was seen that, you know, when one was up, the other was down. So it was this kind of dual system. And what Dr. Porges discovered was that he has been working with studying the vagus nerve for some 30 years. Now, the vagus nerve is I'm not going to get too sort of, technical about it. It's a very simplistic overview of the polyvagal system. But the vagus nerve is a really important nerve that gets calmed through breathing. But it is the 10th cranial nerve, and it has two branches to it. One is the old vagus nerve, which serves the lower part of the body, particularly the digestive system. And the other part is the new vagus nerve. And I'm going to describe sort of what that means. But the new vagus nerve goes up the body and serves the muscles of the face, the eyes, the inner ear, and the vocal intonation. So it's actually very, very important nerve in the body. And what Dr. Porges says is that our nervous systems have evolved consistent with evolution. So the old vagal system, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, is the part that we share with reptiles and invertebrates, and we all have it. And it's the most ancient part of the nervous system, and it evolved about 500 million years ago. And it's responsible for just shutdown, total freeze, total shutdown. Then about 400 million years later, or after that, we had the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, and we all know what fight or flight is. Really what it is it's a process of mobilization in the body. And then with the advent of mammals, some 200 million years ago, we developed this new ventral, or this new vagal system, which he calls the social engagement system. And the social engagement system it was designed because with the advent of mammals, we care for our young in a different way. We have close proximity, we do lots of looking, smiling, we do lots of cooing, and the tone of voice might be more sort of sing-songy, and you might be doing this, oh, it's okay, yeah, it's okay. And what you're doing in that is you're engaging the ventral vagal system, or the social engagement system, and it's a primary attachment system, and it's oriented to feeling safe. And we have these three systems that are operating all the time in our body, and they are primarily an orientation to threat, safety, and danger. And it's a deeply subconscious system for detecting threats and safety. And Porges calls it neuroception. So he's saying it's not just about what we think. It's not a conceptual thing. In fact, he says it's not about words at all. It's not about cognition or words or thinking. It's a really deeply felt, embodied experience of, do I feel safe? Do I feel in danger? Is my life at threat? And so when we're adapting to our environment, we are constantly gauging and adapting to safety. And of course, we know that children, and particularly infants, need to feel safe. They orientate towards relationship. They need to be engaged with and feel safe. So that's our primary. So when we're adapting to environment, we will use our social engagement system first of all. And we will try and befriend. We'll try and kind of find what's safe. If that doesn't work, we will then go to the fight or flight system, which is an orientation to danger and threat, which of course, will activate the heart rate and, prepare us to fight or flight. And finally, if none of that work and we feel that there's a threat to life, we will go into an immobilized shutdown. And basically what that's doing is it's feigning death. It's saying, this is too frightening, it's too scary, I'm not going to be able to survive this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely shut down and freeze. And the part of the vagus nerve that immobilization comes from is the old vagus nerve that goes down into the digestive system. And so lots of people with trauma can have digestive problems. Yeah, and the freezing, so what that looks like in terms of behavior is it might look like a kind of collapsed state. It's very dissociated, and fight or flight, people will then try to mobilize, and fight or flight is often a mobilizing to avoid shutdown. And so these two processes are in people that are traumatized and have developmental trauma. They may very well be recycling in this feedback loop through fight or flight to immobilization, or they may try and keep themselves in fight or flight to avoid themselves going into shutdown. And that can look like, you know, lots of activation, you know, lots of aggression, finding it very, very hard to take in information. And what in that process is very difficult is relating. Yeah, and so what we have to do as practitioners is to try to help people to come into the social engagement system through our tone of voice, through how we're speaking, through eyes, smiling. And of course, at the moment, it's really difficult because, you know, everybody's walking around with face masks on, and a major part of the social engagement system is the smiling. So we have to smile with our voices. And I know that Emerald's now going to talk a lot more about regulation, but when we think about how do we bring people into the ventral vagal system, the first key is to sort of, you know, be in our own ventral vagal system, but also I think the question that I would really like to leave you to consider is, what does safety look like, sound like, feel like? You know, so in the environments that you're working in, you know, what would safety look like? What's the tone of voice? What are the facial expressions that indicate safety? For example, smiling, smiling eyes, having a very attuned presence. So really being able to be in your own ventral vagal system, smiling, really attuning, listening. And as Claire said, you know, breathing, understanding that the breath is actually the bridge and the pathway into the ventral vagal system. Singing is one of the best ways to do it, sighing, and really being able to regulate our own nervous systems so that we're able to manage the transitions for ourselves and then be able to make those safe for those that we're supporting. So that's enough from me. I'm now just going to hand over to Emerald, and if somebody could mute me, actually, because I can't mute myself. So Emerald or someone just mute me.
I just try muting you. Yeah. Okay. I think I've done it. Great. Thank you. So that was a thought-provoking, interesting. Just in this moment, I'd like you just to look out for a moment. Look out, look at the colours around you, look at the shapes around you, maybe look for round things, anything round you can see in your environment at the moment. Okay. Any colours? Is there a predominant colour around you? Colour of the walls? I can see a lot of green outside from where I am. I can see the trees blowing. So just coming into the present moment, sometimes when trauma's talked about, what happens is we get into the field of trauma. And this means that we start to experience a little bit of maybe freezing or agitation and so on, depending on our experiences. So just coming back into the room. And I've been looking at the internet, you know, as many of you will have been over this period of time, just listening and watching to what people are saying and different thoughts on things. And Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Bruce Perry are two people that I kind of honed in on, particularly paid attention to. And so I thought I'd pull out some of the main themes. And they relate very much to particularly the slide that Siobhan finished with. So they talked a lot about our own regulation. So they were talking about, Christina's going to talk a lot more about how to work with children, but this part they were very pragmatic and about us working with our own regulation and in that way creating safety for the people that we work with. So I'd like you just to start to think about this, and you can use the chat box, and at the end of talking, if there's any questions, comments, and so on, then we'll, from Siobhan or myself, just put them in and we'll have a look at them when I've finished and before Christina starts. So right now, just notice your breathing, notice your muscle tone, your mind state. How often do you actually stop and do this in a day? How often do you turn towards yourself? Because how we are then creates safety for other people. Can we have the next slide, Siobhan? Thank you. So when we focus on our own regulation, we have mirror neurons. Now, this is something that we didn't mention, but mirror neurons are in the limbic brain, and they pick up, they're in the evolution system, and they pick up on other people. So unconsciously, we mirror breathing patterns, heart rate, body posture. And some of the research that I did was to teach psychotherapists to unmirror, to consciously unmirror, so that we become aware of this connection between us through the mirror neurons. So we resonate with each other. So I resonate with my people I see, they resonate with me. So this is important because parents, colleagues, children, the people we work with, all pick up on this and we pick up on them. So how do you regulate? It's imperative that you become familiar with what helps you regulate. So how much sleep you're getting, exercise, good company, emotional support, fun, laughter, interests, time alone. These are things that stimulate that ventral vagal response, or contentment, or simply put, feeling well. And in lockdown, this has become difficult, I think, for us. The things that we rely on, the things that we would normally do, we're not able to do, to pop and see people, or we certainly haven't been able to do, you know, and to do some of those things. So we're working very hard. We're working with distress, we're working with fear and anxiety, our own as well as others. And the ways that we manage our ventral vagal system, or feeling well, are limited. So how have you done that over lockdown? What have you noticed about that? Have you managed to put other things into place? What's your sleep been like? How's your exercise been? You're taking care of yourself, because stress and fear are contagious. But also, if we get ourselves in the right place, happiness, laughter, calm are also contagious. So we can really affect through this system, and through our breathing, we can really affect how people are when they're with us. And I really don't want you to underestimate this. You know, this is a very important tool when we're working. So what has helped and what is helping? Can you maybe put something in the chat box about that? I'd be really interested. I think it's very important. Again, we're in relationship. It's hard on a webinar to be in relationship, but it's really good to try to share these things, you know, and to help each other and give each other ideas about things. Let's have the next slide, because there was another area which I found very interesting, which was decision fatigue. So how many decisions are you needing to make every day compared to before lockdown? How many decisions are you needing to make? I mean, we have to make decisions about going to the shops. When do we go? Will there be a queue? All of these. So we constantly, and then we're making more and more decisions, how to manage lockdown, how to manage transitions. Everything is a decision, and then decision fatigue is becoming very prevalent. So what can we do about this? There was a piece of research that Bruce Perry did, which showed that when making decisions about probation, the decisions when people were fresh were very positive, As it got towards a break and lunchtime, people got hungry, they got tired, they made too many decisions. Their decisions became much less positive. And then there's a break, and then the decisions become positive again after a break, after rest, after sleep. So can we, you know, Steve Jobs used to wear the same thing every day, didn't he? Barack Obama wore the same thing every day, or he had 1 or 2 outfits apparently. Edison ate the same food every day. So it may be that when we're in this process of making lots of decisions, that we actually kind of decide what we're going to eat, what we're going to wear, and we limit the decisions that we have to make, because the reality is we're making a lot of decisions every day. So we need to take little breaks when we make decisions, marinate the decisions, take time to go for a walk, delay making a decision if you can. So just, do you recognize decision fatigue, and how are you managing it? How is it impacting you, and how are you managing it? And that's great, because we're getting some chats in now and some ideas from people. So let's have another slide, Siobhan. I won't spend too much time on this, but so structure, regulate, relate, and reason. So when we regulate, you know, and we can then relate so much better, and then we reason. But not only do we reason, we can really start to use our creativity. So structure, predictability is the key that prevents external chaos, internal chaos and anxiety. And managing transitions. Now, you've probably thought about this, but, you know, to manage transitions, we do this every day, but in these particular situations of coming out of lockdown into school, from family into school, children need small transitions from the classroom, and think about these transitions carefully, ones that we may have taken for granted before. So, you know, some of the ideas were breaking the transitions down, using music, dimming the lights, doing certain activities before leaving to go home, or when coming into school, or moving between things. And we've lost, the other thing is we've lost so many rituals, haven't we? There's been a loss of rituals, wakes, confirmations, changing schools, changing classes. All of these things have been lost during lockdown. So maybe we can be creative, look at new rituals. What hasn't happened? Is there a creative way we can create some new rituals? Can we just go on to the next slide, Siobhan, so I don't, that's it. So having people around us in a safe place, safe people, yeah, act as stress regulators in itself. If we create a safe environment, if we feel regulated and we're aware of ourselves, then this brings the stress level down generally. The body, Siobhan talked about the body. In fact, all of us have talked about the body in our introduction, you know. And so what about the body? Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen's work is absolutely brilliant with children. You know, we need to move to drum, to dance, to support orientation movements, the ability to move the head, to not get stuck in frozen shoulders. Yeah, very important. And drumming, so we want to unlock the freeze and flop and give children plenty of creative activities that really allow them to do that, as well as quiet time. So, and I'm also thinking, what about the parents? Can we help them regulate? Is there something we can encourage them or involve them in doing, part of a yoga community, some education on regulation, so that we're working together as a community to do this and to help each other to do this, you know. And in terms of resilience, we've got through a difficult time. We are getting through it. So we can use this to build confidence and resilience and creative solutions. So this is really my sort of message. Christina's going to say a lot more to follow this about how to work with children, but this is really about you, and you are very important in this whole process, looking after yourself. So I'm just going to have a look at the chat box now and just read a few things. So people are already sharing tips on here, aren't they? maintaining, talking about swimming, I saw. Let's have a look. Can I get the chat box to get a bit bigger? Do you want to have a look at the chat box too, Siobhan, just see if there's anything? So people are walking with their dogs, exercising, keeping in touch with friends and family, you know, digitally. Oh, I've lost my chat box now. Hang on. What's happened there? Okay. Yeah, swimming, great for the head. Ice cream, somebody says. So it sounds like there's many of you.
So Emerald, someone said here, I found creating structure for myself and my family to substitute for external structures that fell away helped. Maintaining routine of sleeping, eating,
Yes.
And screen time limits. Reading book club, insight timer, guided free meditations, walking in the garden. Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen.
Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. I can write it in the chat box when I've finished talking. She's an occupational therapist who specialises in movement through from the embryo right through, and she's fantastic for movement ideas and mindfulness type things. She's done this for many years now, many years. Yes, I've just lost the chat box completely. I don't know what happened. I think when, yeah, okay, got it. Got a little bit now. Yeah. Can you see any more there, Siobhan?
So just a couple more, then we'll hand over to Christina. So
Yeah.
I've been sea swimming every evening. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Watching the sunset from the water has been great for clearing my head, and breathing through the feeling of immersing myself in the cold water really helps with managing that feeling in general. Well, that's amazing. Allocating time to walk with my dog every day in the local park.
Great. So it seems as if you're really working on this and really aware of your own health, your own regulation, what takes you into that ventral vagal, feeling good, feeling like you want to relate, feeling well. Yeah, I've managed to get a bit up here. There's lovely things in here, aren't there? Lots of people using resources, creating structure, using nature. It's marvellous. Joe Wicks with the kids. So nice balance of things as well, doing physical things, but also meditative things. And of course, we know that breathing, meditation, mindfulness, being out in nature, these all naturally help us just come into the contentment system. So thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. And we're going to hand over to Christina now.
Thank you, Emerald. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen with my PowerPoint with everybody. So there we go. Okay, so just a kind of little, I suppose, definition of what developmental trauma is. There can be acts of omission or commission in terms of how it happens. So in my experience, the majority of parents want to do the very best for their children. And when things go wrong, often it's as a result of a lack of awareness, or there may be preoccupation or disconnection due to depression or poverty, or the parents may be reeling from their own experiences of trauma. So I just want to emphasize, when we talk about trauma, I'm always talking about it with a kind of sense of compassion for parents, even if their children are subjected to any sort of developmental trauma. So the trauma can happen pre-birth, while the baby is growing in the womb. And that could be as a result of a mother's inability to look after herself, or a direct abuse from domestic abuse from a partner. During the birth, there can be complications, and traumatic birth can really have, we're coming to understand this a lot more now, can have a profound effect on a child moving forward, even into a family that are well resourced in order to be able to support that child emotionally. And then there's trauma from separation and loss through early development, the experiences of neglect and abuse, accidents, for example. We don't often think about that, but when children have accidents, it can traumatize them and leave, we're often thinking about the impact of trauma on the body. And anything that creates a sense of overwhelm or a shock or feelings of powerlessness or entrapment will leave a child feeling traumatized, experiencing trauma. And even from routine medical or dental procedures, for example, if children are being held down during those procedures, that needs to be addressed post-surgically or treatment, so that the child is not left with the imprint of that trauma on their body and their mind. So the impact of COVID, what sort of things are we looking out for, and particularly when children start to come back out? And there is a lot of fear around. There's a lot of fear. Children are fearful, but parents are also fearful about re-engaging with the world and the social world. What might we need to prepare for this? So I work mainly at the moment with children in the care system, although I do work with other children too. But my experience is that most children are doing okay. And many are actually even, excuse me, thriving as a result of the experience of lockdown. And my observation of that is that for some children, the world can be a really stressful place. Attending school, navigating the school environment, the challenges of academia, dealing with peer relationships can actually really put a heavy weight on a child's ability to cope. And I observe many children really relishing this experience of not having to engage with those stressors and being able to benefit from the availability of the adults around them, who themselves are in some ways maybe less stressed. I mean, there are other stresses that have come from COVID for adults, but we're perhaps not rushing around as much as we were. Perhaps we're more present with our children. And particularly children who I found working with had been presenting quite insecure. I see a heightened experience of security from those experiences, from the safety that's been created, the containment provided by the adults, particularly around the anxiety that's in the media about COVID. Adults who've been able to contain that for children has been a very important way of somehow buffering the children from the impact of the stress. But other children will emerge and are emerging traumatized with a nervous system that's primed for anxiety and grief, fear, threat, survival, and self-protection. And any situation or event that leaves a child feeling overwhelmed and alone needs to be considered as a trauma. So for us to be mindful of that as adults. And it may be loss or separation through bereavement. It may be that they've lost a friend, they've lost the availability of their friendships because they haven't been able to meet up with their friends, loss of predictability, and Emerald talked about the rituals that normally carry through children through development and transition, which are very important parts of all our lives to help us, particularly to deal with change and to assimilate and somehow develop strategies to cope with new experiences. There may have been experiences of neglect or abuse, and which may have been heightened and exacerbated by the pressure on families during lockdown. And of course, we know that rates of domestic abuse have increased considerably since lockdown started. I'm not sure about the statistics in Ireland at the moment, but in the UK, Child Protection Services are predicting a 250% increase of referrals over the next 6 months or so. So, and what about teenagers? Teenagers often get bad press. They can be the kind of repository for all of the negative projections that society holds, that they need to somehow put somewhere perhaps it's to rid ourselves of those uncomfortable feelings. And if this didn't have the dated language in it, you might see it as a headline in a the Daily Mail, for example, the children now love luxury, they've bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders. Children are now tyrants. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, and tyrannize their teachers. And this, as you can see, was written a long time ago. But there's something, particularly for adolescents, I think, in society, where they can be seen as difficult and trouble. And it's fascinating to read this quote, because have things really changed for our perception of adolescents? You know, what do we project onto them? What do we put into them? What sort of characteristics do we bestow on them in terms of trying to sometimes keeping ourselves okay, but also it can be a way of trying to make sense of some of the challenges that we experience from teenagers, because after all, they're coming into their own individuality, and they're able to challenge and question in a way that we can find uncomfortable. So for young people, lockdown will be and will have been a very difficult experience. You know, the idea of being vectors of a virus for children and adolescents is really a huge amount of pressure, and the blame then that can come with, for adolescents who are not actually practicing social distancing in the right way, and are kind of deemed to be putting other people at risk. And lockdown, during lockdown, there was a huge loss of contact with peer relationships, which are very important for development, we know. And for these young people to have to deal with the anxiety that they might actually transfer the virus to somebody that they love very much, the conflict with that, being able to see their friends, is a heavy burden to bear. And often adolescents, you know, are particularly adolescents who experience developmental trauma. We can find all sorts of ways of trying to explain that trauma. You know, it's difficult for adolescents because sometimes we don't see them. We don't see the pain that they're in. We don't realize what they've been through. And we don't appreciate all of the strategies they have developed to try and help themselves to cope. So problems develop when people internalize conversations that restrain them within a narrow description of the self. These stories are experienced as oppressive because they limit the perception of available choices. And I see adolescents as a group that can have, as I said, so many qualities or so many attitudes or ways of explaining behavior put onto them that somehow can leave them marginalized, where we don't see the impact of the trauma. And children often bring all their stored up anger, hurt and pain and shame with them that they've gathered in the past. And alone, that would be too much for any adult to bear. So can we really look behind the hood, or look behind the attitude, or look behind the defenses and the rejection and perhaps the avoidance to see what's really going on for these young people? They will have developed what we call internal representations of the world. You know, what is the adult world like? Can it be trusted? Can they rely on adults to understand them and accept them and support them through difficult times? So just to think a bit about complex trauma or developmental trauma. So post-traumatic stress is usually refers to a single event trauma, whereas developmental trauma is trauma that occurs pre-birth through child development. And then complex trauma, sometimes developmental trauma and complex trauma are used into, they're kind of used, some people use them to just try and describe the same thing, but complex trauma actually refers to a series of repeated traumas. It doesn't necessarily appreciate the development in the womb. Trauma can be considered as a brain injury. It can leave children with underdeveloped systems and impaired systems that are not able to function in the way that they need for healthy development. Their social engagement system may be offline due to a lot of fear and threat during early development, lack of safety and security. And when we think about trauma, and this comes from the ACEs work, what we need to think about is not what's wrong with you, but actually what happened to you, so that we can try and make sense of the experience of these children. You know, sometimes we'll think that the child needs to be assigned a diagnosis of a particular disorder, and diagnosis can be very helpful. But for children who've experienced developmental trauma, a multidisciplinary assessment process is important, so we can factor in how the trauma is impacting the child's nervous system and sustaining the what we might call symptoms, or the self-protective mechanisms the child has in place. And we need to think about what the child's strategy for survival and safety and self-protection is, because when children have experienced developmental trauma, they will have a strategy that they have somehow use to make sense of the world around them, but also to protect themselves from what they see are threatening experiences. We know that children with the most severe trauma are highly defended, and they can be difficult to reach because of that. They're operating in trauma time, not in the here and now. So their memory systems are very much set up around what happened, particularly during early development, if that was a traumatic time. And we don't necessarily remember what happened consciously at that time, but implicit memories really influence the whole child's system, their mind, how their mind function, how their bodies function, and how they make sense of the adult world around them. There may be dissociation, and that's a way of trying to cut off or shut down to protect, as Siobhan was explaining earlier on, from threat. And when there is repeated trauma, then that can cause a lack of integration. You know, development is very much about integration, integrating different systems, integrating different experiences across feelings, thoughts, bodily states. And when children have been subject to persistent trauma and they've been in constant fear states, they're not able to process those experiences. And because of the lack of safety, their bodies are maintained in a state of threat, which makes it impossible to integrate. They experience feelings and sensations as threatening, so they have no access, often have no access to positive emotions. They're not able to feel positive emotions and are quite threatened by any feelings of threat. And we might ask them how they feel or how they experience something, and they will, or what happened in a particular situation, and they'll often say they don't know. And I in my experience, those children, sometimes the child needs to trust us before they'll open up, but children who consistently say they don't know, often they're usually coming from a place where they don't actually have the words to be able to explain, to be able to formulate somehow their experience. And their stories may appear inaccurate or exaggerated or unconnected to the facts. And so you can get a kind of piecemeal presentation of experience. There's a lot of fragmentation. So it's very difficult to somehow, from the child's stories, to make sense of things that happened. And it may appear that these children lie. These children are often alone with feelings of pain and shame, and the nervous system has been primed in that way. And so because of that, the child can still feel alone in the here and now, even though they may have caring people around them trying to support them. And the social engagement system is not online, so the child is not able to use the safety and support that's being offered to help them. And they can shut down and stop caring about anything. They may lose the capacity to care. You know, sometimes people say, well, particularly for adolescents and adults, this person needs to take responsibility for this. But actually, when you're in that level of trauma and self-protection, it can be very difficult to do that. And all energy is expended by just managing and trying to survive. So it is exhausting to get through the day. And sometimes when it comes to later in the day, particularly when these children come home from school, they can feel depleted, and it can be very difficult for them then to meet demands in the adult world. And because their development has been impaired and is incomplete, they don't have enough resources to draw on to be able to meet the many demands of the world around them, surrounding them. And they're operating from a danger-orientated map. So everything can be seen as a threat, which makes it very difficult then to be able to make sense in a balanced way of the incoming stimuli, what's being presented to you. Even we know from research that neutral faces can be seen and believed to be threatening. So we know when children's nervous systems are balanced, their activation is low, and they can be open and curious, and they can be in their bodies, and they're open for connection. They're flexible in their behavior and their willingness to negotiate with us around that, and they can feel good about themselves and competent and able to achieve things. There's an emotional stability, which is much more likely, and we're less likely, this applies to all of us, of course, and children are less likely to present with physical symptoms when they're in those low states of arousal, just right states of arousal. And what's really important to recognize that the child recognizes that they have choices and options, so they can be more flexible in the way they respond, and there's less likely to be defensive behavior. So just to talk a bit about behavior management and trauma, because this is something I think is very important for us to think about, because children who are traumatized often come with some of them serious behavior problems, and how to respond to that can be quite challenging, particularly in the school environment. So just to think about some of these points. So we know that with developmental trauma, the brain and body is underdeveloped usually, and there's a lack of foundational regulation. Foundational regulation happens from the earliest experiences of having caregivers co-regulate with the baby, helping the baby to calm down when they're stressed, but importantly, the caregiver themselves being calm or calming down when they pick the baby up. And the child may not have the capacities due to developmental delay to be able to perform or to respond in ways we would expect of a child of their age. So there's often a kind of gap between chronological age and emotional age for these children. We see, because I look at behavior as communication, and we can see it that way. And that once we start to think about it in that way, then we can become curious of what is triggering the child's behavior. Is it trauma triggers? It may be a smell, or it may be the sound of somebody's voice, or it may be an image. Children can have all sorts of experiences while they were in the trauma and having the traumatic experience that's paired with particular with parts of their senses that can then be triggered when those senses are stimulated. And a child's survival strategies can trigger escalating cycles of behavior in an attempt to escape what they perceive as threat, because remember, they're coming to the world with a lens, they're looking out, perceiving threat everywhere. And very often these children need to feel in control, because that's the way you keep yourself safe. And that's a very challenging behavior for many adults. To be able to recognize that, but also to be able to negotiate with the child so that the child can find ways of feeling safe. And what if the children receive negative consequences for trying to self-protect? What might that feel like for them? How confusing might that be? And if there's a lack of epistemic trust, Peter Fonagy talks about this as how we transmit cultural knowledge to our children, how we help them to learn about the world and how we are with each other as humans, how we live in groups. And part of epistemic trust is actually being able to trust your parents enough and the adults enough around you to offer guidance and to be able to follow that guidance. And for children who don't trust adults, then that's a very difficult thing for them to do. Traumatized children are often unable to account for themselves. So to be able to explain what they think, what they feel, what they like or don't like, or why they behaved in a particular way. And what if there's sensory processing issues, where the child is either overstimulated by sensory stimuli or understimulated, so they're not able to cope with what's going on in their internal system of their body. So timeouts are often used as a way of trying to help children to perhaps have some space to think about their behavior. But for children who are traumatized, I believe the timeouts just reinforce a child's perception of the unavailability of adults to understand and to help them to co-regulate. Actually, these children need time in, because it's the availability of the adult who's calmed themselves to then calm the child that actually primes the child's nervous system to learn to self-regulate. So before self-regulation comes co-regulation. And that's how children can gradually learn to manage the fear and the anxiety that erupts within their nervous system. Our responses may deter the child from using their social engagement system when stressed. Actually, what we want them to do is to learn to do that, to come to us and know that it's safe and they'll be understood, and they'll experience comfort and support rather than shaming and rejection. And feeling safe and understood really helps us to feel accepted. You know, despite our behavior, if somebody's able to accept that we're a good person and we had good intentions, then that's very reparative for children who've experienced trauma. And when a child feels safe and their internal needs are satisfied, remember that's when they're most available and ready to interact and connect to and explore the world in a positive way. So we often think about helping the child to change their state, you know, their internal state in order to change behavior. And that can be helpful, you know, using different supports for the sensory system, for example, is a really important way of doing that. And actually by doing that, that can actually change the whole constellation of behavior from the child. However, we need to be careful about that with traumatized children, because if we're not making space for the child's difficult feelings, it's going to be very difficult for the child to learn to be able to recognize, understand and accept those feelings and find ways of being able to deal with them. So helping the child to change state, but also helping the child to learn to tolerate and be with difficult feelings is important. And when children begin to understand their own stress physiology, then that's when they start to be able to develop greater self-control. They're able to become more self-aware, and they're able to begin to mentalize themselves and other people. And that's quite an empowering experience. We know the positive relationships are transformative. And one of the greatest gifts that we can bring to children is the gift of containment. We know that overwhelming feelings, we as workers, as practitioners, we can consciously pick them up from a child or a parent. And that's also a reciprocal process, as Emerald and Siobhan have explained, because they can also pick up that dysregulation in our system. It's so kind of primal and so unconscious. You know, I often have noticed that if I'm not 100%, I'm not feeling 100% when I have a session with a child, they'll pick it up, even though I'm trying to manage myself and regulate myself. Children are being told that they have to socially distance, and I think this is going to be a really tricky one in terms of physical comfort. However, it's important to know that we don't have to touch children and hug them in order to help them to regulate. You know, if we're able to hold and tolerate the feelings, the unbearable feelings the child has, and regulate ourselves in the process, then that's a very holding, emotionally holding experience without it necessarily being physical. We know that touch is really important for children, and you know, we will try and maintain that as much as possible. But for example, in the school environment, that's going to be very difficult. Can children trust their messy feelings are received and accepted without negative judgment from us? And can we somehow take in those feelings and hold them for them and give them something back that's digested for them in terms of their experience, that signals that we're safe people, and that we can tolerate and hold those feelings for them. Kozolina talks about sociostatic regulation, which is how we regulate each other's biology, psychology, and physiology through our communication of calm and be maintaining calm, but also the intention of helping the other person to calm down.
That's great. Thanks, Christine. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up so that we can come into some space for question and answers.
Okay, is it okay if I just do this last slide, because this is about intervention. So just to, not to assume that the child is okay, because children can look like they're okay when they're not. Some children become very adept at covering up their distress and their difficulties. So, you know, being attuned and observant is really important. And we need to equip ourselves with the insight of what it's like to look through the lens of the world for that particular child, because every child is different and they'll have a different experience. Where are the safe people for a child, and what are the safety cues that we can send out to let them know that we are safe for them to engage with? And try and keep things ultra predictable. We've talked about all that already. And for the most traumatized children, we do need to minimize the number of people we make available to them so we don't overwhelm their nervous system. Have at least one committed caring adult who's accepting of the child and their behavior. That doesn't mean we don't set boundaries, of course we do, but we communicate that in a kind and loving way. An adult who's able to be playful. Playfulness is really regulating. If it's actually child-led and it's attuned, it's very regulating for the nervous system. Being curious and empathic. Promoting physical power and strength through movement. For children who've experienced trauma, to feel powerful in their own bodies is key. And movement is a wonderful way of doing that. So any sort of physical sports, activities, dance, drama, anything that entails movement, but just to watch out that some children can actually trigger into higher arousal through movement. So it's important to watch the child's response and to redirect them into a more calming activity if that's difficult for them. Enabling a child to see themselves through your eyes, through your attunement in your mirror and mirroring in your effective communication. Enabling a child to discover their strengths and talents. And children need to know that there are helpers around and available to them. I'm a helper, you might say, and helpers are important when children are having a difficult time. And that's important through helping children to tolerate difficult emotional states, particularly a sense of vulnerability. Helping the child to learn to self-reflect and mentalize. And therapy needs to be focused on assessment of the child's development resources and readiness for therapy. Certainly as a psychotherapist, I've come to a place where I recognize that, you know, I was trained to create a narrative with a child around their experience, and that's important. But if we try and move to that too quickly, that can be very difficult for children, because they may, in terms of the development of the primitive brain, they may be unable to formulate that narrative because they haven't got the development of the prefrontal cortex. So working with the body and working with sensations is really helpful. Helping children to build their physical resources and working somatically before we move into processing the trauma is key. And we can do things like when the children come back out into school, for example, or into places of support, we can explore the experiences and the emotions the child has had in groups or individually. And I used to run a group with traumatized children called My Superpowers, where the child was helped to recognize their capacities and the things that support them and the things they are good at, to help them to feel powerful and competent. For other children, it might be my COVID experience, and using art and creative expression is wonderful, because then the child doesn't have to find words. They can project their feelings into an image. So just the other thing is about sensory modulation for the primitive brain. So working on the body and the senses and sensations, and bringing in food and movement and experiences around smell, taste, touch, images, looking at how they will help the child to feel calmed through engagement with those media. Okay, I'm going to come out there because I know you want to have some time for questions, Siobhan. Is that okay?
That's great. Thanks, Christina. So if you stop sharing your screen, and then if the panel, so Emerald and Claire, if you could unmute and come back in video screen, that'd be great. So what I'd like to do is, we don't have a massive amount of time. We've got about 7 minutes left. But if somebody would like to, if you've got any questions, if you just put them in the chat box. But in the meantime, I would really like to invite Claire to just say anything you would like to in a few minutes, just to give you a bit of airtime.
Thank you. Well, I suppose one of the things that I've always felt quite strongly, and I was very sad when CAMS moved from being called Child and Family Consultation Services in the UK to Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, because really unless we understand the relationships that that child has, then we really are barking up the wrong tree, because we can provide a lot of support for a child, but actually they've got to go and live in an environment that may be adverse to them. And lots of children have parents who themselves have had adverse childhood experience, and it goes back through the generations. So one of the things that I've always felt quite passionate about is that systemically we need to understand relationships, so that, for instance, the project we're doing with this special school, all of those young people have been out of mainstream school because they've experienced adverse childhood experiences, as had their families. And nothing's going to get those children back into school unless we engage with the families. And this is something I think social services do, have the capacity to do really well. They don't have the resources, they don't have the time to do it. And I've felt increasingly uncomfortable as a psychiatrist, that we're locating problems in the child, and particularly psychiatrists making diagnoses, which I feel uncomfortable with, because once you've made a diagnosis, then you've created a problem, not a solution. So I suppose that's really one of the things that I feel very passionate about, is that actually we really need to be thinking more widely than just focusing on the needs of the child, because in isolation that can become a little meaningless. And the other thing is, how do we work with breathing in children? If we're really thinking about mind body and integrating of these experiences when a young person's had trauma, it's really important that we skill people up to know how to work with families around breath. I don't know many therapists who do, and also to have the confidence to work with all ages about how to explain using the breath to enhance the parasympathetic system. And another time it would be really good to talk about biofeedback, because through practicing breathing, I could show you on a EEG in front of you how I can bring my mind and my electrical activity in my brain and my pulse rate and my body stability just through body posture and the way I breathe. And I don't feel that's mainstream in mental health. And I think that's why I've been so excited to meet Graham Music from the Tavistock, because he really gets this. But it is a minority of people who are working with the breath, although it's becoming more mainstream out there in the population, and it's in the papers. Yes, so that's those my kind of two points, I think.
Great. Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to stop recording now because we're starting to get a few questions. We don't have masses of time, but we've just had a question. So I'm just stopping recording.